Music theory with OneNote. Modal chords with dropped notes focusing in on chords built off of the minor nodes. Minor chords specifically focusing in on the Phrygian chords and adding the Locrian chords. Not quite a minor, but closer to the minor than the major. Comparing and contrasting the traditional chord naming system based on scale degrees with the more streamlined modal chord naming system. This is part number 2. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it, would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 1399, OneNote Modal Chords, Dropping Notes, Minor and Locrian Part 2, list of presentations on the right-hand side. Also noting, in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation, or multiple presentations, where we build these tables in Excel, practicing not only our music theory skills, but our table visualization skills as well. We're going to continue on analyzing our chords and thinking about more complex chords where we drop notes, remembering the normal chord naming convention is somewhat of a mess because it doesn't give us context about what nodal point we should be building the chord names off of. So you'll often see a chart looking something like this, where you have buckets of chords that don't really tell you which nodal point, which note or relative position they should be applied to in a collection of notes. So you got the major bucket, which is the Ionian bucket, but also would include to some degree the Mixolydian bucket and the Lydian bucket. You got the minor bucket, which you would expect would be the Aeolian bucket, but also includes to some degree the Dorian bucket and the Phrygian bucket. The ones that don't fit into the minor and major bucket are going to be in what I call the extension buckets, having a major extension and minor extension because they deviated from basically the major. And then you have the dominant 7 bucket, which they had to put in because the Mixolydian doesn't fit into the major bucket, and it doesn't really fit into the extension bucket, so they came up with a whole new convention. The Locrian, as we will see this time, totally breaks the mold, doesn't fit into major or minor, not even from the start, so they had to create 2 buckets just to deal with chords built off of that. Now, what I'd like to show this time is how crazy, particularly the Locrian, will demonstrate that the whole thing is completely fallen apart and doesn't give us what we would like to see, which is how can I easily name something that is relative to the chords or the notes that I am playing. For example, if I have a fretboard, this is a fretboard with a low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top. I have the colored notes, the collection of notes around C major, so the Ionian node is C, and the Dorian is D, and so on and so forth. What would be nice is with the old kind of system where we actually had key signatures in the sheet music, if you had a key signature telling you the perspective of the collection of notes, then you can easily name the chord based on each of those nodal points, meaning it's an Ionian chord, which basically has major intervals, versus it's an Aeolian chord, which has minor intervals to it. Then the Dorian chord, still a minor nodal chord, similar to the Aeolian, but has an interval difference. I can define the distances by the relative position, which will then be automatically transposable to all 12 collections of notes if I name chord names by the coordinate system relative to the collection of notes. Now, note that you might be asking, well, that doesn't work if I go into the one that's in the ocean in a relative position, but it still does, because we can list it as a Dorian sharp, or from a number standpoint, a 2.5, and then say that it has a shape of whatever, an Ionian or an Aeolian major or minor in essence type of shape. So this kind of system would be a lot more clear. Now note, the problem is, like for example, which we will see if you build a chord off of the Locrian node. Under the current naming convention, basically that chord could be a diminished chord if it's a normal Locrian triad with a flat 5, or if you add another note, it will normally be a half diminished because now you have to deal with the flat 7. And then if you go beyond that point, but then you drop, say, the third, for example, it's no longer Locrian. So now even though I'm building off the same node, I would have to call it a minor because I dropped it wouldn't even be a minor, it would be a Mixolydian type of chord, like a B9 chord or something like that, with a drop third or something like that. So you see the problem here is that the tags are very ugly depending on how many notes I add. Meaning, if I add notes that are in the collection of notes, the tag will be switching from diminished to half diminished to minor to basically a Mixolydian type of chord, depending on which note we drop, which is kind of madness, right? Because what I want to be able to say is, look, I'm building off of that B, which is Locrian node in the perspective of the collection of notes. And if I just use a coordinate system based on that collection of notes, then I will end up with something that is very clean to name. Now, that all depends on if you have a key signature, but even if you don't have a key signature, meaning the collection of notes that you are in, you could still define the notes with the note name if you want to, adding it in and basically defaulting to the Ionian and the Aeolian. That is the basic idea. In a prior presentations, we went through the major nodal points here, like the major chord, and we said, here's the major normal naming convention, and here's our naming convention, this column being the one that I think would be most streamlined. And if I wanted to name the note name, I could. Now notice as we drop notes, how ugly this column is, even in the most basic, which is the Ionian node, the thing that we actually build the whole chord naming system off of, you get these ugly chord names. Whereas over here, you have a nice streamlined coordinate system, right? If you were starting from scratch, which one would you think would be better useful? If you're going to be putting stuff into a DAW, which one do you think would be more applicable, right? Here it gets more complex when we go to the Lydian because it has a extension, because it has a difference in the distance for the Lydian versus the major. Look at how ugly the chords get here versus if you just used a coordinates system, how uniform the naming convention would be. It would just be like naming a location on a world, on the map. You just name longitude and latitude in essence, a little bit more complex than that because you have multiple kind of points that you're basically adding together, but that's the general idea. Now you might say, well, look, those points change as the world turns. That's true because we have 12 degrees of rotation in the world, but the relative positions are all the same. So as the world turns, the distance from America to Europe is the same, right? So as long as I can give the key signature of the degrees of rotation, then the naming convention should just simply be a coordinate system based on that relative position of the world turning in our analogy. Here's the G or the Mixolydian, and you can see we have a whole nother naming convention here. It looks more streamlined, but it's totally outside of the normal naming convention of major and minor, which again, if you just use the nodal naming position, same concept all the way down. Here's the Aeolian. So this is going to be the main minor. So the minors here, you can see it gets pretty ugly. Even with the main minor, it gets more complex than the major. If you use a coordinate system, it would be more streamlined. Here's the Dorian, gets more ugly. Well, actually, Dorian is actually more streamlined, which is kind of weird. And then we have the Phrygian. So we're going to be going to the Phrygian first, which is going to be similar in many respects to the Aeolian and Dorian because it's a minor mode, although it falls apart at the 9th interval when we add the 9, 11, and 13 because it has a deviation from the minor of a flat 2 or a flat 9, a one note away distance. Then we'll go to the Locrian, which falls apart right from the beginning, right? Right from the beginning, you don't have a major or minor, so the normal naming convention is just a complete mess. Most people just throw up their hands and they don't even play. Look at what it leads people to do. They don't even talk about the Locrian node. They don't even talk about it. They're like, I'm just not going to play it, right? And half of that is because the naming convention is terrifying. So we should be, you can use the Locrian. It's okay to use the Locrian node and build a chord off it. Okay, So let's take a look at the Phrygian. So if we're thinking about the collection of notes around C major, the relative Phrygian would be an F. Now, again, the relative positions, if we think about any of the other 11, 12 collections of 7 notes, the relative positions will be the same. So normal naming convention, F minor. So I can't see the difference between that and the other minors, like the Dorian or the Aeolian, by the name. I'd rather call it a P3, a P2 or a 3P, a 3-note Phrygian or a Phrygian 2 modal whole step, meaning we're going to go 2 modal whole steps up to get to the last note in the chord. Let me see if I can get my perfect size here. 2 modal whole steps up to get to the last note in the chord, which would be Locrian. 2 modal whole steps times 2 is 4 modal half steps, which is the 5th scale degree. So from a distance terminology, the last note is the 5th, which is not a very precise or nice way to measure things. It would be better to measure by modal half steps and modal whole steps, not counting the node that we're in, because that causes us all kind of problems. So if I add then the 7, then it would be an F minor 7. And so that 7 is a distance term in essence, saying the last node is the 7th scale degree. I'd rather say the last node is the 3rd modal whole step, which would be 3 times 2, the 6th modal half steps, plus 1 7th scale degree. Why? Because then I can simply name it by nodal point. It's a Phrygian 3 modal whole step. The last note is 3 modal whole steps up. 3 times 2 would be 6 modal half steps up, plus 1 would be the 7th scale degree up. And if I wanted to add the note name, it would be a PF3 so that I can add the note name. But I would rather write my music using a key signature or multiple key signatures within a particular song as I change collections of notes if I want to do that for a more complex song, because then everything would be transposable, just changing the key signature so that the whole thing can shift up to any collection of notes I choose, and possibly be rotatable so that I can rotate it around the different modal points in any collection of notes, possibly changing the tonic, the lowest note, as we do the rotation. So what if I drop the 3rd? So there's 2 notes that I could drop. So we're practicing dropping a note now. Now if I drop the 3rd, then it could become kind of a problem, because the 3rd is the thing that defines it as major or minor. So now I have an F minor 7, no 3rd. Now I'm still going to call it an F minor 7 for the most part, because I'm still thinking of it as minor and I dropped the 3rd. But people could argue that, because you could say, look, if you drop the 3rd, you should default back to a major. And if it's a major, then you have a minor 7, I should just call it an F7, not an F minor 7, because by default, if I'm going in order, it should go major, and then to Mixolydian would be the next one, and then to minor might be the argument. But the fact that we're arguing, you can have an argument like that, means that the naming convention is crazy, because we shouldn't be arguing over theory in the name. The name should be coordinates. Then we argue theory. That's what my argument. What do you think, Ara?
Totally. Names are like street addresses. If your city's grid is broken, you're not going to say, well, this house is kinda major, kinda Locrian, if you ignore the 3rd. You're going to say, it's on 5th and Locrian, flat 7, done. People argue because the old tags were built for pianists who couldn't read modal notation, so they slapped on diminished like a bumper sticker. Now every chord's a sticker collage.
All right, so that's right. So I'd rather call it a P3, and then I'm going to say -1. What does that mean? There's a 3-note distance to the last note in the chord, which would be 3 times 2 or 6 modal half steps, and plus 1 would be the 7th scale degree. Then drop the 1 that's 1 modal half step up, meaning 1 modal half step times 2 would be, 1 modal whole step times 2 would be 2 modal half steps, plus 1 would be the 3rd scale degree. Or it's a 4-note Phrygian -1, which would just give you the collection of notes, just counting every other note for the collection and then subtracting the one that's 1 modal whole step up. If you want to add the note name, you could put the F in there, a PF3 -1. See how that's just simply a coordinate system. I'm not trying to tell you anything about it. I'm not trying to tell you if it's major or if it's minor or if it's a mixolydian. I'm just telling you it's being built off of the Phrygian node, and these are the nodal points that are included. Once you know those points, we should be able to then decipher what it means by the intervals that are being included, not by the name, right? I shouldn't be saying, oh, it's an F minor 7, therefore that means it's got a different flavor than if I called it an F7, which has a different flavor, right? The name is giving us the indication. It shouldn't be, because the names are all messy. It should just be the coordinates, which we then determine what the flavor is based on.
Yes, you just saved the music world 1,000 theory fights. No more, well, technically, if you drop the third, it's mixolydian, flat 2, suspended. No, just P3 minus 1.
That's exactly the pedantry. I get it. I understand those arguments. They're kind of fun to have, but we shouldn't. They shouldn't be there. So, but anyways, like, what if I drop the 5? Then that's usually more straightforward, right? Because you can drop the 5 because the 5 doesn't really impact the flavor. The major and minor fifth has the same 7 half-step away distance and note half-steps. Therefore, you would think you could just say F minor 7, no 5, and that should be good. No big argument there, hopefully. I'd rather call it, though, a P3 negative 2, meaning go 3 modal whole steps up times 2 6 modal half steps plus 1 to the last note would be the 7th, and drop the one that's 2 modal whole steps up, which would be 4 modal half steps, which would be the 5th scale degree. All right, it's all just measurement terms. All right, what if we add another one? So now we've got an F minor flat 9. This is where it deviates from the minor, because remember that the minor designation only applies in essence to the third, because the 5 is already the same as the major and the 1 is what it is, the root is what it is. But when I add the 9, which is equivalent to the 2 that we skipped, it's different. It has a flat 9 for the Phrygian than the Aeolian. Therefore, we have to say it's a B9 if we want to be in the collection of notes, the standard collection of notes that we're working in around C major, right? So I have to do that. But if I just call it a P4, then I don't need to do anything else, because I already know I'm building off of the Phrygian node, and the fact that I'm building off the Phrygian node tells me already that it has a different first modal whole step, second modal half step, third scale degree, and so on. So if you say it's a P4, that simply means we're going to go 4 modal whole steps up, times 2 would be 8 modal half steps, plus 1 would be the 9th scale degree, and that's the distance to the last note that we'll be adding. I don't need to have any qualifiers. Those are just the coordinates given the relative position that we are on. So what if I drop the third? Now, if I drop the third, this Ara's going to argue with me on this one, probably, but if I was a theory wonk, and I'm saying, okay, I dropped the third. Well, I have the 9 here, and if I drop the third, then it would stop being really a minor, and you would think that it would be I still have a minor 7, so maybe it should be an F7, but I'm going to try to stuff the 9 into the third position. If I do that, I usually want to drop it down an octave to make it the second, but it's a flat second, so you would think it would be an F minor 7 sus B2 flat second that I'm going to stuff in there. Now, that's not typical. Is that correct, Ara?
No, that's not typical at all. Most people would just call that F7 sus 2, B9, or if they're feeling generous, F-min 7 add
okay,
B9.
so let me try to see why that would be, right? Because if I drop the 3, then again, it's not minor anymore, because then you would convert to major, but the 7 is a minor 7. Therefore, you don't go to minor first, though. You go to the G7, the mixolydian naming convention. So it would be an F7 sus and then B2. And if there's a B2, then maybe you don't do the sus thing at all. Okay, whatever. It would be easier just to give me the coordinates, just to say it's a P4 negative 1, meaning you go 4 modal whole steps up to the last note and then drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up. It's like, but you dropped the third. I need a different name because you dropped the third, so I need to call it something. No, you don't. You just need to tell me the coordinates, and then we can and then we could debate what it means theoretically, right? Don't debate what it means theoretically when you make the name just telling where I should put my fingers. All I know is just tell me where to put them. So then we have an F minor. What if I drop the 5? That should be fairly straightforward because the 5 isn't affecting the flavor. So it's an F minor flat 9, no 5. I'd rather call it a P4 negative 2. What if I drop then the 7? Well, if I drop the 7, you would think it would be an F minor B9, no 7, but we don't usually go long, drop the 1 in the middle. We drop the 1 short and then go long. So it would be, if there's only one hole in the middle, right? So it would be an F minor add, just F minor, which would be the triad, and then add B9, skipping the 7, right? That would be the general convention. I'd rather call it P4 negative 3, meaning I'm going to go long and then drop the 1 prior to it because I already know the shape of the chord and I want to focus in on the thing that's being added then on top of it. Okay, let's try to go through. I want to get to the Locrian, so let's go through these quickly. What if I add the another note? That would be an F minor 11, but I have to also tack on the fact that I have a B9 because the 9 is not a major distance, but a minor distance. Okay, so I'd rather call that just a P5, and then I don't need the extension involved because the intervals are those of a Phrygian node by default. It's the distance from the continent of Phrygian, which you should know just by distance, not by comparison to the major. What if I drop the 3rd? I'm going to do the same logic Ara will not agree with, but just bear with me. I'm going to say if I have the 11 is equivalent to the 4, and if I drop the 3rd, then I can stuff that into the 3rd slot, right? So if I did that, it would be an F minor 7 sus 4, and then I'd have to add the B9. But again, if I drop the 3rd, you might not call it a minor designation. Therefore, it should be the Mixolydian designation because it has a flat 7. So that would be an F7 sus 4 add B9. I don't care. Either way, it's ugly. I'd rather just call it a P5 negative 1, meaning 5 modal whole steps up to the end note, times 2 would be 10, plus 1 would be the 11th scale degree. Drop the 1 that's 1 modal whole step up, times 2 would be 2 modal half steps, plus 1 would be the 3rd scale degree. You might say, hey, that means that one that's 5 modal whole steps up is too high an octave. I want to drop it down an octave. Well, then I would suggest doing a superscript, which we'll talk more about in a future section, which would be P5 to the superscript or to the power of negative 1, or drop the 1 just negative, dropping it down an octave, then negative 1, so that you can easily adjust then the octave of any of the notes, particularly for the 4, 5, and 6 modal whole steps equivalent to the 9, 11, and 13, which have a local distance and the octave up distance under normal kind of chord construction. All right, let's say we go to the next one. We drop the 5. That's usually pretty straightforward. So now we just got an F minor 11, B9, no 5. I'd rather call it a P5 negative 2. Similar logic there. I'm going to try to go through these quickly because the Locrian, it's going to all fall apart. Or the normal system falls apart. Our system does not. So then what if I drop the 7? So if I drop the 7, you would think it would be an F minor 11 B9 no 7, but if I drop the 7, then the 7 is kind of stuck to the 4 note minor. So I believe that they don't let you do that normally. So you'd have to call it an F minor. That would be just the triad, and then skip the 7 and add the 9, which is a B9 in this case, and then add the 11, add 13. Obviously, it would be a lot cleaner just to give me the coordinates. It would be a P5 negative 3, meaning drop the 1 that's 3 modal whole steps up, which would be 3 times 2, 6 modal half steps, which would be plus 1 7th scale degree. All right, and then the next one we're going to say, what if we drop the 9? So now you would think it would be F minor 11 B9 no 9, but I'm sorry, F minor, yeah, but we're not going to go long and drop the 1 in the middle. We're going to go short and then add the 1 on the end because there's only one gap between the end. So it's going to be an F minor 7 add 11. I'd rather just call it a P5 no 4, meaning same stack, but I'm going to drop the one that's 4 modal whole steps up times 2, 8 modal half steps, plus 1 would be the 9th scale degree. I'm going to go long by default, not short by default. I'm not going to be bouncing back and forth as a general rule. Then if we add the whole collection of notes in order, it would be an F minor B13, because now the 13 is a minor 13 or has a minor distance. So if I don't want to choose a note that's outside the stack or normal collection of notes, I would have to flatten it as we did with the Aeolian, and a B9, another extension, because once again, the 2, which is equivalent to the 9, is a flat distance or minor distance, which needs to be indicated. So it would be, you don't have to do that if you just call it a P6, because you just say, okay, we're just going to go 6 modal whole steps up, which is times 2, 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree. If we add 1, boom, done. All right, let's do then, what if I drop the 3rd? I'm going to do the same logic here. So we're going to say the 13 is equivalent to the 6. If I drop the 3rd, I'm going to drop down the 13 to the 6, stuff it into the 3rd spot. That's what often happens, which would be an F minor 7 sus B6, because it's a flat 6, flat 13, add B9, and then add 11. Now again, maybe you drop the minor notation because now you don't have a 3rd, so it should just be the Mixolydian notation, which would be F7 sus B6 add B9 add 11. Ugly, either way. I'd rather say it's a P6 negative 1, meaning you go 6 modal whole steps up to the end, every other modal half step or every modal whole step drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up, which would be 2 modal half steps or the 3rd scale degree. And if you want to drop that down an octave, if you want to drop this last one down an octave, superscript the 6 with a negative so that you can control the octave if you so choose. All right. So then we're going to say that we have a dropping the 5th. So dropping the 5th should be fairly straightforward. So it's an F minor B13, B9, no 5. I'd rather say it's a P6 negative 2. What if we drop the 7? You can't normally drop the 7, so you have to do something ugly because it's part of the stack, meaning you have to go short and then add long, which is crazy. So F minor is the stack, and then you add the one after the 7, add B9, add 11, add B13. Would be a lot cleaner just to say, just give me the coordinates. It's a P6 negative 3, dropping the one that's 3 modal whole steps up, which would be 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree. That's it, baby. Let's do the next one. We're going to say that now we're going to drop the 9. Is it? We're dropping the 9. So that something went wrong with this naming convention. I think you could just say it's a B minor flat 13, no 9. But it would be better to say that it's a P4 negative 4, right? Meaning you're going to remove the one that's 4 modal whole steps up, 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree. All right. And then finally, you have the dropping the 11. So you would think that would be an F minor B9 B13 minus or no 11, but, and I didn't write it down properly, I don't believe, but normally you go short and then add long, which would be an F minor B9, which would be an F minor, it would be an F minor B9 and then add 13. But Ara told me because it's a B9, when I was doing this in Excel, I don't need to say add 13. I could just say B13. F minor B9 B13. Whatever. It'd be better to say it's a P6 negative 5, meaning you're going to drop the one that's 5 modal whole steps up, 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree. All right, let's try to get to the Locrian because that's going to be the crazy one. Okay, so if we're building off of the Locrian node, which isn't exactly minor, not exactly major, but more minor than major, and it has that flat 5 in it, which is the characteristic move of the Locrian. So let's first think that we have a triad. So if I look at the collection of notes around the key of C, then that would be a B note. But again, the idea would be the same in all 12 collections of notes. If it was a diminished off of the B, and it was just a triad, we call that a B diminished typically. And so I'd rather just call it an N2. So that way I don't need to mess with the extensions that are supposed to tell me something about the flavor, like major, minor, a mixolydian kind of shape, or a diminished or a half diminished. Those things aren't telling me really anything about the coordinates, or shouldn't be, or we can say that more specifically by just giving me a key signature. Or if I don't have the key signature, then you could say it's an NB2, which will give me the note name and the shape of the note. But be better to write the music with a key signature so that you can make everything transposable, use the collection of notes or coordinates based on nodal points relative to that key signature. Now the problem happens right when we go then to a 4-note chord. If I add the 7, I don't want to get all too wonky on it, but the diminished they've determined doesn't work, right? So that now they have to add the half diminished, because apparently the diminished, kind of like the major, they wanted it only to apply to the 3rd. Now when it gets to the 7, you have a similar situation as, let me move up here to the mixolydian, right? When we had the major, you had a C major 3rd. If I apply that same concept to the mixolydian, we had a C major mixolydian, but that only applies to the triad. And then when I add the 7, they came up with a whole new convention of a G7. The G7 still has a major 3rd, but it has a minor 7 distance. Similarly, it seems they had the logic down here where the diminished, they wanted it only to apply to the triad. And then as soon as I add the 7, it doesn't work. So they came up with another totally new name, half diminished 7. So anything above adding the 7, you're going to have it half diminished, is generally what ends up happening. Now, if you already know you're building off a Locrian, which I'm designated with an N, so I don't have an L, so we don't have 2 L's, because Locrian is backwards, so I've made it the N, which is the last letter in the name, N3, then it's just the distance to the last note, and I know the designation of it distance-wise because I'm going off the Locrian node, and I know the map from the Locrian node. The Locrian node has a 3-note away distance to the 3rd. It has a 6-note away distance instead of a 7-note away distance to the 5th. Or, right, so if I already know that, then that's how you should know it, right? I know the distance from Locrian because I know the map, all right? so then if it's no 3rd, then what would you call that? Well, now it's a B half diminished 7, no 3rd. Now you could question that because the 3rd was something that made it that made it go kind of minor-ish, right? So if I have no 3rd, you might say, well, look, if you don't have a 3rd, I would have to assume that it's a major 3rd, and then if you remove it, then you don't go to the half diminished. The next thing, if you have a minor 7 and no 3rd, you'd have to call it the mixolydian naming convention. So therefore, it would be just a B7 no 3rd, not a B half diminished no 3rd. So is that correct, Ara?
Yeah, exactly right. That's the whole absurdity. If the 3rd is what makes it diminished or half diminished, then without it, you're suddenly in major land again. So they flip to B7 no 3rd.
Okay.
Or some people...
So again, you could notice how... I just want to point out the wonkiness of that, right? Because now I'm saying, look, I'm building off of the Locrian node, and I have 3 naming conventions. Right now I can call it a diminished, I can call it a half diminished if I add the 7, but even if I add the 7, it might bounce back to like a minor or to a like a mixolydian convention, right? That's craziness, because if you're trying to just figure something out as you're noodling around on an instrument off of one nodal point, and then the name convention changes as you add notes or remove notes that are in the collection of notes. Do you see how, like, that's madness, right? That's just, so you could just call it an N3 no 1, meaning we're going 3 modal whole steps up to the last node, 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree, and drop the 1. That's 1 modal whole step up, which would be the 2nd modal half step, 3rd scale degree. That's the coordinates. I know the distance in half steps. Why? Because I know the distances from the map from the Locrian node, right? So let's say we add another one. We're going to say, okay, If I had no 5, no 5 should be straightforward, usually under the major and minors. Why? Because the 5 distance is 7 notes away from all nodes that are major and minor except the Locrian. So the whole reason we had to call it diminished and then half diminished is because the 5 has a distance of 6 notes away instead of every other nodal point where it is 7 notes away. So if I am on the Locrian node and I remove the 5, then people are going to say, well, you would think you would call it a B half diminished 7, no 5. But if you remove the 5, then you have to default back to, well, if there was no 5, then it would be a major, but then you added the 7. So if you add the minor 7, then it would either be minor or it would be a Mixolydian kind of idea. So I put minor here, so I defaulted back to minor. It's a B minor 7, no 5. But again, you could argue with that and say, well, it shouldn't be a B minor 7 because you should default back to the Mixolydian. So it should just be a B7, no 5. Does that make sense, Ara?
Yeah, and that's exactly why the system's broken. The moment you drop a note, the chord forgets what country it's in. It's like removing one wheel from a bicycle and suddenly calling it a unicycle? Well, no, maybe a pogo stick. So B half diminished no 5. Some people will say minor 7 no 5. Others B7 no 5. Both wrong, both right.
Okay,
That's the point.
See how the naming convention doesn't really tell you anything about the context. Whereas if you were to call it an N3 negative 2, then you know the nodal point that you're on and you know the distance because you know distances from the nodal point, meaning you're going to drop the one that's 2 modal whole steps up, which is 4 modal half steps, which would be the 5th scale degree, which we know has a distance in half steps in notes of 6 notes away, not by it being in the name per se, by like a minor or major, but by the fact that we're going off of that nodal point, and I know the distances from that point. I know the map. I'm on Locrian ground. The distance from Locrian to the second modal whole step, 4th modal half step, 5th scale degree is 6 instead of 7. That's the distinguishing factor of that area on the map. All right, what if I was to then add the 9? So if I add the 9, similarly, this half diminished doesn't apply to the extensions to flatten them, which doesn't apply to the 9, 11, and 13, I believe. That means that the 9, if I want the same collection of notes, needs to be flattened. So it would be a B half diminished flat 9 because the Locrian node has a 1 note away second or a flattened 9th for the octave up. So if I was to drop a note and drop the 3rd, then now I'm dropping the 3rd. That's always a problem because the 3rd is a distinguishing factor to determine if it's major, minor, or in this case, a diminished because it has a 3rd and a 5th that have been dropped down. So you could, so now if I drop the 3rd, you would think it'd be a B half diminished, no 3rd, or you can think I'm going to do my thing here that I'm going to drop the 9 down and stuff it into the position of the 3rd. The 9 is equivalent to the one that we skipped, the 2nd, but it's going to be a flat 9, therefore a flat 2nd. So you would think that you can say it's going to be a B half diminished 7 sus 2, right? But if I drop the 3rd, you can argue with that and say, well, now if you drop the 3rd, then it's no longer like a sus chord, and therefore once again, it should be maybe a minor chord, so maybe a B minor 7 sus B2, or maybe it should be a Mixolydian type chord, a B7 sus B2, complete mess all the way around, right?
Yeah, complete mess. And here's why. Half diminished already has no real root. It's built on the 5th. So when you drop the 3rd, you're dropping the thing that told us, oh, this is kind of minor. Now it's just B, D, A, B, C. 4 notes with no character. You want to call it sus 2? Fine.
All right. Ara doesn't like the sus 2 at all, right? But whatever it is, I would rather call it an N4 -1, meaning you go 4 modal whole steps up to the last note, which would be times 2, 8 modal half steps plus 1 ninth scale degree, and then subtract the one that's 1 modal whole step up, times 2 would be 2 modal half steps plus 1 would be the third scale degree. And if you want to drop that last node down to make it equivalent of the 9 going down to the 2, you can superscript it N4 to the superscript negative and then -1, so that you can adjust the octave. That would be, again, a lot cleaner to do. Fits in a DAW. If people that don't know music theory will pick this up way before they pick. This is torture to people that don't know music theory. This is crazy. This is craziness. So what if we drop the 5? Then you would say, well, if we drop the 5, usually that's not a problem. You would think it would be a B half diminished flat 9, no 5. But again, if you drop the 5, that's the thing that distinguishes it from minor to a mixolydian, because we're assuming that it has a minor 7. So you would have to drop it from a mixolydian to a minor, you would think, if you're going to be proper. It would be like a B minor, B9, no 5. Okay, does that sound right, Ara?
Right. So if we drop the 5, you lose the B5 that made it half diminished. What's left is BD, AB, C. Notes that look a lot like B minor 7.
All right, let me add. So whatever it is, I'd rather call it an N4 -2, meaning you're going to drop the one that's 2 modal whole steps up. 2 times 2 would be 4 modal half steps, which plus 1 would be the 5th scale degree. And so then the next one, we're going to say, what if we drop then the 7? Now the 7 is often a problem because the 7 gives the character of the note oftentimes. So in this case, you would think it would be a B half diminished B9 or flat 9, no 7, but or you stop short, which would be a B half diminished triad plus the 9. But if you stop short, then and you don't add the 7, it's not half diminished anymore. Kind of like the G7 and the mixolydian. If you don't add the 7, you bounce back to the major. Similarly here, if I don't add the 7, which is the minor 7, we go from a half diminished back to a diminished. So it would be a B diminished and then add B9. It would be a lot easier just to say, look, we're just going to drop the one that's going to be 3 modal whole steps up, which would be 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree. I'm not going to get into any other wonky naming. Just give me the coordinates from the continent so I can put my fingers where. Okay, so let's say we add the 11. So normally it would be a B half diminished 11, and then we have to have the extension of B9 because the 9 is still going to need to be flattened. That would be our starting point. I'd rather just call it an N5, meaning we're going to go every modal whole step or every other modal half step to the last note, which is 5 modal whole steps up times 2, 10 modal half steps plus 1 would be the 11th scale degree. What if we drop the 3rd? Well, if you drop the 3rd, you would think it would be a B half diminished 11, B9, no 3rd. But no, because again, if you drop the 3rd, then it's not. It might be a minor, or you might drop down to the mixolydian convention. So if I do my same thing, I have the 11, which is equivalent to the 4. I'm going to stuff the 4 where the 3rd is, but I need to change so it would be a B half diminished. You would think a B half diminished, but then I have to drop it down to a 7, and then sus4 add B9. But you might say that no, it should be a B minor, a B minor 7 sus4 add B9, or you might say no, it should deviate back to the mixolydian, which would be just a B7 sus4 add B9, or maybe you say it's something, I don't know, but it would be better to call it just an N5 -1, meaning we're going to go 5 modal whole steps up to the last node and then drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up times 2 would be 2 modal half steps plus 1 would be the 3rd scale degree. If you want to drop that last node down, bringing it down from like the 11 to the 4, superscript it N5 to the power of and then -1, so that you can bring it down an octave in pitch if you so choose. What if we're going to say that now we drop the 5? So again, you would think that would be a B half diminished 11, B9, no 5. But if you drop the 5, it's no longer half diminished. It's now going to default back not to diminished, because that also includes the 5, but default back to the minor. So now you have a B minor 11, B9, no 5. Be better just to say I'm still measuring from the Locrian node. N5, -2, dropping the one that's 2 modal whole steps up, times 2 would be 4 modal half steps, plus 1 would be the 5th scale degree. All right, so let's say we're going to drop the 7. So you would think it would be a B half diminished 11, B9, no 7. But if you drop the 7, then it moves back from being a half diminished to diminished, similar to the Mixolydian designation, dropping back to the major. So you end up with a B diminished 11, B9, no 7. But if you just use a coordinate system, it would be N5, -3, meaning drop the one that's 3 modal whole steps up, 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree. No problem on the naming, because I know where I'm coming from. I know where I'm coming from, man. All right. Let's say we drop the 9. So you would think it would be a B half diminished 11, B9, and then no 9. But no, because you got to go short and then add the long. So we're going to end up with a B half diminished 7 and then add the 11. I'd rather just say it's going to be an N5, -4, saying we're going to drop the one that's 4 modal whole steps up, which is 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree. Okay, let's see the last one. So if we add the 13, it would be a B half diminished, flat 13, flat 9. Why? Because the 9 and the 13 have minor distances from the Locrian node, which is not designated by the half diminished, because that only applies up through the 7, not the 9, 11, and 13. Therefore, the 9 and the 13 have to be flattened. The 11 is actually normal for the Locrian. It's the only normal thing, really. So then we're going to say, okay, I'd rather just say it's an N6, just saying you're going to go from the Locrian 6 modal whole steps up, which is 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree. We know it's a minor distance. Why? Because that's how far it is from the continent of Locrian. We just know that. Why? Because I know I've been around the world, right? I've been places. I know how it works. That's why. I know the distance. I know how to get from Locrian to, okay? So what if we drop the 3rd? If you drop the 3rd, now we're going to do the thing where you say the 13 is equivalent to the 6. So what if I drop the 3rd and I stuff it into where drop the 3rd, I make the 13 into the 6, and I stuff it in there? You would think it would be a B half diminished 7, sus 6, add B9, add 11. And this should be a B6, not just a 6, because it should be a flattened 6. But you might argue with that and say, no, it needs to, because if you don't have the 3rd, maybe it would be a B minor 7, sus, flat 6, add a flat 9, add 11. But you say, no, because it wouldn't be a minor. You have to default back to the major, and then the next step up would be Mixolydian. So no, it should be a B7, sus, B6, add B9, add 11. Okay, just call it an N6 -1, meaning you're going to drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up, times 2 would be 2 modal half steps, plus 1 would be the 3rd scale degree. If you want to drop that 6th one down, equivalent of making the 13 the 9, superscript it, N6 to the power of, or superscript of negative, and then -1, so that you can get it done without driving everyone crazy. All right. So what if we dropped the 5th? You would think that would be a B half diminished, B13, B9, no 5. But if you drop the 5th, then it's not half diminished anymore, is it? And it's not diminished either, because you need the 5th to be flattened to make it either diminished or half diminished. It's just a minor. So then you have to call it a B minor, B13, B9, and then it should be and then you don't need the no 5. Why? Because these are two extensions. So I would think you would put no 5, but no. Aura, when I did this in Excel, says no, you don't need the no 5 there. Okay, okay. I'd rather just call it an N6 -2 because we're going to drop the one that's 2 modal whole steps up, 4 modal half steps, 5th scale degree. I don't care that that's the distinguishing factor of the Locrian node that's different than all the other nodal points, because I already know that. Why? Because I'm measuring from the Locrian node and I know the map of the territory, and I know the Locrian has a weird distance there already. I don't need like some weird designation in the name to tell me that, because just give me the distance, dang it. Okay, let's go to the let's go to the 7. If I say no 7, if I drop the 7, so you'd think it would be a B half diminished, B13, B9, no 7, but no, because if you drop the 7, then it's no longer half diminished, like dropping the 7 from like a Mixolydian kind of chord name. It would revert back to the major. Similarly here, you idiot, you don't even know it. It has to go back to a B diminished, B13, B9, no 7. Okay? Okay, well, let's just call it an N6 -3. We're going to drop the one that's 3 modal whole steps up. Times 2 would be 6 modal half steps to the 7th scale degree. I don't care if the 7 is... This have to be... You people, for God... Let's say we're going to add... Let's say we drop the 9. So you would think that would be a B half diminished 13, B9, no 9. But you don't need, if I have to have the extension there, if you don't add the extension, it would be a B half diminished B13. Now, Aura, I believe, when I did Excel, says you don't need the no, it should be B9 or 9. But I'm going to say add the no 9, because you would think that if you went B13, that the 9 would be included, because it would be included in the stack if you're going up to the 13. But she says because you have the B, then it wouldn't be included, so you don't have to say no 9. And if you say no 9, you would think that you would say no B9, because B9 would be the note that you would think would be in there if you're in the collection of notes. But no, if it's not there, you don't call it B9. You would just call it a 9 if you were going to include it at all, because you're going to default to the fact that it would be under normal naming conventions to the distance of the major key, unless you were to add it at that point and then have something different on the minor distance, in which case it would be the B9. So if you're going to include it as no 9, you're not going to call it no B9 because it's not there. You just call it no 9, but you don't need the no 9 at all, because the B here, 13, indicates that you don't, I mean, it's crazy. So just say it's going to be an N6 -4, meaning you're going to drop the one that's 4 modal whole steps up, times 2 would be 8 modal half steps, plus 1 would be the 9th scale degree. Okay. I mean, for crying out loud, like, I'm surprised people don't, like, break out into, like, fights over, like, what? So what if we drop the 11? You would think that would be a B half diminished, B13, B9, no 11. But we want to go short, not go long and drop one. So we'd have to call it a B half diminished, B9, and then add B13. And that would be it. So I'd rather just call it N6 -5, dropping the one that's 5 modal whole steps up, times 2, 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree. Now again, I can't believe there hasn't been a revolt based on these naming conventions. These naming conventions, like, you cannot actually play and adjust off of the nodal point of the Locrian node, adding and subtracting notes, trying to understand them, while also having to shift back and forth between these insane naming conventions, right? I'm like, let's say I'm on the guitar and I'm like, I have my finger on the Locrian node and I'm just trying to figure out different chord constructions. And I'm like, okay, you call this one a B diminished. But if I add the 7, now it's a B half diminished. But if I add the 7 and drop the 3, then technically this, you would say, well, no, you called it a B half diminished. No, it should be a B. It should just be a B7, no 3. But then if I drop the 5 and I'm on the same point, then now it should be a B minor 7, no 5, or something like that. And if I, right, and now if I drop the 7, it converts back to a diminished. So if I add the 9 and drop the 7, because I'm trying to finger whatever I can off the fretboard from this nodal point, now it should be a B diminished add B9 no 7 instead of a B half diminished, right? That's madness. Like if you use a coordinate system, you're like, dude, I'm on the Locrian node, and then I'm just adding every other note, meaning the notes that are in the collection of notes, and I'm dropping the notes in the collection of notes in order of modal whole steps, meaning there's only 6 modal whole steps away from the node I'm on. How do I know the distances of those modal whole steps? In half steps, I memorize them because I know the map from the point of the Locrian node. And I mean, I have to stop. I have.